In today's video, we are going to talk about how the election is shaped by events that happened 100 million years ago. To convince you that this video is going to be worth watching and sharing, let me sum it up in two images. First, here is a map of how counties in the United States voted for president in 2016. Red counties leaned towards Republicans, blue counties leaned towards Democrats. And if you go to the South, you can see this Nike swoosh that extends from Missouri all the way up into Washington, D.C. This Nike swoosh exists in election after election as you go into the past. The second image is the North American shoreline in the Cretaceous period. The ocean levels were higher, the water was warmer, and you can see that this ancient shoreline lines up almost perfectly with this Nike swoosh of Democrat counties. That is what I'm trying to explain to you today, why this shoreline connects to who we vote for president today. This video is important for two reasons. First, it is just going to blow your mind to see what happens here. I have been thinking about this all week. The second reason why it's important is because it really gets to the heart of economic growth. You're gonna see how economic growth is affected by different elements that can extend as far back as the Cretaceous period. This could just be a random spurious correlation, right? There are people who explore spurious correlations just to get a laugh out of us. One of my favorite ones is that the number of people who drown every year is correlated with the number of Nicolas Cage movies that came out that year. And clearly there is no connection between Nicolas Cage and people who drown, at least as far as I know, though maybe I should check when his next movie is coming out before I get into a pool.
Hold your breath!
So I don't want to just explain to you a random correlation and say, hey, this is something important. We need an economic model that connects what happened 100 million years ago with what's happening today. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take you step by step back to explain to you exactly how economics has led to this situation today. By the way, Market Power is a community of people interested in and excited about economics, so I hope you subscribe. The first question that I want to ask in the series of questions going back to prehistory is, why does the South vote Republicans anyway? Now, this is a little weird because you might remember this tiny event that happened years ago called the Civil War. The Civil War was the North versus the South, but it was not just regional fighting. There was a political aspect to it. You had Republicans in the North who were campaigning against slavery, and you had Democrats in the South who wanted to protect slavery. You might hear about this today. A lot of people will continue to claim the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. In fact, all of these Confederate statues and Confederate names on schools were all Democrats. And you can see after the Civil War ended that this regional political divide existed. If we go to the 1884 election, you can see in the North you have red Republicans and in the South blue Democrats. But today that has largely switched. And the question is, why? Why does the South vote Republican now? One of my favorite papers exploring this switch comes from two economists, Ilyana Kuziemko and Ibanya Washington. They argued the switch occurs when JFK comes out in support of civil rights legislation. In the 1960s, there are these big questions about the civil rights movements and how we can make sure blacks have their political rights. And in spring 1963, Kennedy comes out supporting civil rights legislation. Well, these economists look at support for presidential candidates for the 1964 election, who would have been Kennedy and Barry Goldwater. And they look for support among whites in the South and in the non-South. And they find that support for these two candidates was similar across these two regions before that 1963 speech. After that 1963 speech, the non-South continues their support at pretty similar rate. But in the South, you see this major switch where people who supported Kennedy now switch their support for Goldwater. From this point forward, the South supports Republicans and not Democrats. Now, of course, blacks who had been Republicans are going to support Democrats because the Democrats are fighting for their voting rights. So what we're really seeing here is that this Nike swoosh is where you have the greatest black population density. In fact, if we look at a racial map of the United States, where every dot represents a racial group, these green dots represent where there are higher black population densities. And that green dot density actually matches up even better with this prehistoric shoreline than the political support does. Let me just pause for a second and say, yes, this is an economics channel and we are talking about politics, but that's because a lot of our political institutions affect our economic outcomes. And that's why blacks would have been strongly supportive of the Democratic Party that was coming out in support of their voting rights, because when they lose their voting rights in the South, they also lose a lot of economic opportunity. So our economic opportunity drives our political choices, and our political choices determine who the president is. So this is a really interesting connection between economics and politics, and is not something that we should ignore. So now that we've determined that these areas are where you have higher black population densities, the question now is, why do these areas have higher black population densities? Now, the answer seems obvious at first glance, and that is slavery. You have more slavery in these areas, and the question then is, why do we have slavery in the South rather than the North? Well, it's a common misconception to think that we just had slavery in the South, but in early America, there was plenty of slavery in the North. In fact, New York City had one of the highest slave population densities in the entire country. Over time, though, the slave institution concentrates in the South and it leaves the North. Now, why does it leave the North? It's not because all of a sudden there was this ideological moment where they realized they didn't want to have slaves anymore. It's because they couldn't afford them. There was economic competition for them. One of my favorite studies on this comes from Gavin Wright, and he shows that people were complaining that prices were just too high. They couldn't get the slaves that they wanted. So economic forces bring slaves from the North and have them concentrate in the South. So what economic force is driving slaves to concentrate in the South? It's cotton production. Cotton is an incredibly valuable crop at this time. High prices, huge demand for it because we're going through industrialization, we're making textiles. People want cotton to put into their factories. So if you're making a really profitable crop, people are going to be willing to pay higher prices for slaves. And so slavery becomes economically viable for expanding cotton production. Somebody promised me dinosaurs in this video, and I have not heard of dinosaurs yet. Well, don't worry, we are getting there. We have not gone back 100 million years, but we've gone back 150 to like 200 years so far. And this has been really helpful. We're seeing the causal connections here. The next logical question here is, why was cotton growing in the South? Why weren't people growing cotton in the North? Now, one obvious answer is the climate. The climate worked really well for cotton in the South, but there's another answer, and that is the soil. The soil in the South was incredibly productive. It brought forth lots and lots of cotton. And so when you have an area that has a comparative advantage in producing cotton, it leads to all these attractive forces to bring slavery in there. So cotton grew in the South because it had climate, but also a really good soil. Now I have mentioned soil, and hopefully now you're thinking, there's the connection. During the Cretaceous period, you had the shoreline that divided the land from the sea. But early life was scarce on the dry land, but was thriving underwater. As you have this thriving life living underwater, they eventually die. The ocean floor becomes a graveyard for these species. When the ocean recedes, as the earth gets cooler, and as this land becomes dry land, those areas have more organic material in them. And that is the final piece of the puzzle. Let's walk through this. This actually ends up being a very famous economic model called the Engerman and Sokoloff model. You have prehistoric conditions that lead to really good soil in these areas. That soil leads to a comparative advantage in cotton, and cotton becomes economically viable for slavery. Because you have slavery in these areas, you have more blacks living in these areas, and because you have more blacks in these areas, when their voting rights are threatened, they vote for the candidates that support their rights. And because they vote for those candidates, today we see this Nike swoosh of political support. Now, I want to address just one question, and that is this geographic determinism? Is this something that was destined to happen because of something that happened 100 million years ago? The answer is no. So many points in this could have been changed. We didn't have to produce cotton here in the United States. Cotton was also being produced in Egypt and India. If people had never decided to move to the United States and create cotton, that wouldn't have been how things evolved. There was also no reason why people had to support disenfranchising blacks, right? Those are choices that are disconnected from the soil. The soil and this geographic part gives a different comparative advantage, but there was still room for choice along the way. Whoa, what was that? Oh, that's another video that I've done on politics and economics. This one is about how stock markets reacted to presidential assassination attempts. Also, I invite you to subscribe to Market Power so that way you can join this community of people interested in and excited about economics. We will see you next time.